I never planned to speak about this publicly. For years, silence was my protection. In the world I came from, words are not harmless. They open doors, they expose paths, and sometimes they invite things that should never be invited. But after leaving that life, after walking away from the darkness that once shaped my every breath, I realized something unsettling. People were suffering without knowing why. Homes were being tormented, families were being attacked, and many of them had no idea that the reason they were vulnerable was painfully simple. When people imagine witches, they often picture chaos, random curses, spells thrown wildly, shadows moving without order. That is not how it works. The spirit realm is not disorderly. It is structured. It operates by laws. And those laws determine where we could go, what we could touch, and who we could never reach no matter how strong we thought we were. There were houses we targeted deliberately, homes filled with anger, bitterness, fear, unresolved trauma. Those were easy. You didn't need force to enter. You didn't need rituals. The door was already open. Emotional wounds act like invitations. Unforgiveness weakens walls. Despair creates cracks. We could feel it before we even arrived. A heaviness, a pull, a sense that access had already been granted. But then there were other houses. From the outside, they looked ordinary. No symbols on the door, no religious signs in the windows, no outward indication of protection. Yet the moment we approached, everything changed. The air would feel thick, almost pressurized. Our thoughts became confused. Our confidence evaporated. Some of us felt physical pain, headaches, nausea, tightness in the chest. Others experienced sudden fear that made no sense. We called those homes sealed, not because we could see anything, but because something unseen was already there. We could circle those houses for hours. We could chant. We could attempt remote influence. Nothing worked. It was as if an invisible boundary existed, one that could not be crossed. And the most frustrating part was this: the people inside often had no idea they were protected. Early in my training, I asked questions. I wanted to understand the difference. Why some families were easy to enter and others were completely inaccessible. My mentors didn't like those questions. Curiosity was encouraged only when it served power. But eventually, answers came. There is something that functions like a legal mark in the spirit realm. Not a charm, not a spell, a seal. And seals are recognized universally. When a seal is present, access is denied. Authority overrides force. And no amount of darkness can violate a legitimate spiritual boundary. We learned quickly to recognize the signs. Animals would behave differently near those homes. Technology malfunctioned when we attempted surveillance. Dreams sent against the occupants would rebound, sometimes violently. Some witches experienced nightmares after attempting entry, as if something had followed them back instead. That was the unspoken rule. Never attempt a sealed home more than once. Those who ignored that rule didn't last long. One woman in our circle tried repeatedly. After her third attempt, a voice speaking scripture in her dreams, even though she had never opened a Bible in her life. Within months, she lost everything: her sanity, her influence, her physical health. No ritual could reverse it. That incident changed the way I looked at what we were doing. Because seals don't exist by accident. They are the result of alignment, authority, and something far older than witchcraft. It marks it. Marked as off limits. Marked as watched. Marked as defended. These sealed homes were not perfect families. They had problems. Element present in every single one of them. One thing that created a barrier we could not penetrate. At the time, admitting this truth felt like betrayal. It challenged everything I had been taught about power. Because if what protected them was real, then everything we believed about control was incomplete. And if people understood this one thing, truly understood it, many of the attacks they blame on bad luck, mental health, or coincidence would simply stop. That knowledge is why I left. Because once you see a boundary you cannot cross, you begin to ask who placed it there and why. A glowing symbol, a ritual performed at midnight, some kind of visible barrier. In fact, you can chant for hours, fast for days, sacrifice comfort. Darkness knows this. Witches are trained to recognize it early, because ignoring authority has consequences. The seal we encountered was not powered by fear. Fear actually weakens protection. It wasn't powered by perfection either. Many sealed homes had broken people inside them. What mattered was alignment. We could sense it instantly. A presence that wasn't aggressive, but absolute. Not loud, but unmovable. Thoughts we tried to plant wouldn't land. Emotional pressure wouldn't stick. Confusion would dissolve before it could take root. This is where most people misunderstand spiritual attacks. They think protection is about fighting. It isn't. Fighting implies struggle. A seal eliminates the fight altogether. Never challenge what has legal right. That phrase was repeated constantly. It's decided by who has been granted authority. The homes we couldn't enter had been claimed, not temporarily, permanently. That claim wasn't made by the occupants themselves. That's important. People love to believe their own strength protects them. When someone aligns themselves under a higher authority, they come under its jurisdiction, and jurisdiction determines access. Darkness cannot trespass where it has no permission. That's the truth many people aren't taught. I remember one assignment clearly. On paper, they were vulnerable. Grief usually opens doors. Depression creates entry points. Everything suggested the house would be easy. But the moment we approached, resistance appeared. Not emotional resistance, structural resistance. Like trying to push against a locked door that doesn't budge no matter how hard you lean. We withdrew immediately. Later, I researched the family quietly. No witchcraft countermeasures. No rituals. Nothing outward. But I discovered something else. Not dramatic. Consistency establishes permanence. Temporary faith creates temporary covering. But consistency creates a seal. That was one of the most uncomfortable truths I learned. Because it meant protection wasn't reserved for special people. It wasn't exclusive. It was accessible. Anyone willing to align could have it. Another misconception is that seals are fragile. Authority doesn't vanish at the first sign of weakness. It remains unless it is willingly abandoned. We relied heavily on deception to get around defenses, fear-based dreams, familiar voices, emotional manipulation. But sealed homes neutralized those tactics automatically. The deception couldn't anchor itself. The lies didn't resonate. Some witches described the sensation as being watched. Others described it as being evaluated, not challenged, not threatened, simply denied access. That denial is what terrified us, because denial implies a higher court. One incident pushed me closer to leaving than anything else. A man in our circle attempted to bypass. The result was immediate and severe. He collapsed during the attempt, claimed he was pulled upward against his will. He never practiced again. After that, the rule changed. Do not attempt indirect entry on sealed homes, ever. It fears authority humans can align with, and that authority does not require perfection, intelligence, or spiritual expertise. It requires surrender. By the time I understood how the seal was established, spiritual were still unprotected. This was the most difficult truth to accept, because it exposed a massive misunderstanding. Belief alone was not enough. Knowledge alone was not enough. Even religious activity was not enough. We encountered many homes filled with spiritual language, symbols and routines that were still completely accessible. From the outside, those homes looked protected. From the inside of the spirit realm, they were wide open. The difference came down to one thing. Authority must be recognized, not just referenced. There is a difference between knowing about authority and living under it. Darkness recognizes that difference immediately. We were trained to look for it. People who spoke confidently, but made themselves the final authority had no covering. That was the uncomfortable part. Many people assume evil targets weak faith. That isn't accurate. Evil targets unsubmitted faith. Faith that insists on control. Faith that demands outcomes. Faith that negotiates instead of yields. The sealed homes were different. Not louder, not stricter, just aligned. Alignment shows itself in small, consistent ways. Decisions made when no one is watching. Integrity when compromise would be easier. Humility when pride would feel justified. These things may look insignificant in the physical world, but they carry enormous weight in the spiritual one. We used to test boundaries subtly. A minor emotional disturbance, a sudden argument, a wave of unexplained anxiety. In unsealed homes, those disturbances grew quickly. In sealed homes, they dissolved before escalating. It wasn't because the people were stronger emotionally. It was because influence could not attach. Attachment is required for interference. Without attachment, darkness has nothing to work with. The answer was immediate and blunt. Protection does not mean exemption. It means ownership. That sentence haunted me. Ownership determines who has the final say. But those experiences did not spiral into destruction. They didn't fracture identity. They didn't open doors to long-term torment. The hardship passed through without leaving residue. In contrast, unsealed homes accumulated damage. Trauma layered on trauma. Fear fed fear. One attack created access for the next. That is how generational cycles begin. Seals stop inheritance. They break continuity. What would have transferred simply stops. This was the point where I began to see the cruelty of what we were doing more clearly. Not because attacks were dramatic. Down without them realizing a source existed. No confrontation. No rituals. No spectacle. Just authority. They didn't obsess over attacks. They didn't constantly scan for threats. Their focus wasn't defense. It was alignment. Protection was a byproduct, not the goal. That contradiction bothered me deeply. I started observing more closely. But to a higher authority they did not attempt to control. Obedience is invisible to most people, but it is unmistakable in the spirit realm. It signals jurisdiction. That's why darkness doesn't break seals. That realization shattered my worldview. It wasn't in rituals or knowledge or secret techniques. It was in surrender. I began noticing the cost of ignoring seals. Practitioners who repeatedly challenged boundaries. Others burned out. A few disappeared entirely. The warning signs were clear. Still, many refused to stop. I knew then that I couldn't stay. Because once you understand that darkness is restricted, you also understand that much of human suffering is unnecessary. Not all pain, but much of the torment people normalize as life. The seal was never hidden. It was simply misunderstood. One of the most dangerous lies we were taught was that protection, once established, was automatic forever. That belief kept many people careless. In reality, seals are not broken by attack. No alarms, no obvious collapse. Just subtle misalignment that feels harmless in the moment. We depended on that drift. Darkness rarely storms a protected home head-on. That draws attention. Instead, it waits for compromise. Small decisions that seem reasonable. Justified exceptions. Over time, alignment is not lost in a single moment, it erodes. One of the first signs we looked for was divided loyalty. That confusion creates access. Not dramatic access. Limited access. Enough to influence emotions. Enough to amplify stress. Enough to make people question peace they once had. That is how entry begins. People often assume exposure means sudden darkness. That isn't how it works. A sense of being drained even after rest. We relied on people blaming themselves for those feelings, or blaming life, or blaming each other. Blame keeps attention away from alignment. Another weakening factor was self-authority. When people begin deciding which principles apply and which don't, that shift matters more than any outward behavior. Even good intentions cannot override misplaced authority. We didn't need people to abandon belief. We only needed them to reinterpret it. Conditional protection is unstable. We were trained to listen for language changes, phrases that signaled drift. I know better now. That doesn't apply to me. I've outgrown that. Those statements sound confident in the physical world. In the spiritual realm, they signal independence. Independence dissolves covering. That's when influence can return. Not fully, not immediately, but enough. Another way seals weakened was through unresolved offense. Offense is not just emotional. It is positional. When people elevate personal grievance above alignment, they realign themselves under emotion rather than authority. That creates a fracture. Fractures invite pressure. Pressure creates openings. We rarely attacked sealed homes directly. We waited for exhaustion. Exhaustion lowers vigilance. Those corners matter. One of the most effective tactics was when alignment becomes secondary to productivity, protection becomes accidental instead of intentional. Accidental protection does not last. Nothing dramatic happened. No scandal. No obvious mistake. Just drift. What terrified me most was how reversible it all was. Re-establishing alignment was simple. Not easy emotionally, but simple structurally. Authority could be restored instantly. Jurisdiction could be reclaimed. Access could be revoked. Instead, they fought symptoms. Symptoms are distractions. That's when I knew the seal was not theoretical. It was functional, and it could be lost, but it could also be restored. Leaving that life did not bring immediate peace. That's something people rarely talk about. In some ways, it becomes harder, because once you are no longer protected by deception, you must face truth without filters. It exposes, and exposure is what ultimately brings freedom. Watching families, watching homes, watching patterns repeat. And what became unmistakably clear was this: the seal was never about superstition, and it was never about hiding from evil. It was about belonging. Homes that were sealed were not owned by fear. They were owned by authority. Ownership is the final layer people misunderstand. It does not linger. It does not return to try again later. It leaves completely, because remaining near something you are forbidden to access carries consequences. Boundaries are not suggestions. They are enforced. That enforcement does not come from the people inside the home. It comes from who the home belongs to. Why tragedy does not erase identity. Why pressure does not turn into possession. Why hardship does not become hopelessness. The seal does not remove storms. It determines who controls them. There is no warning siren, no dramatic collapse, just a gradual shift. Alignment becomes optional. Authority becomes negotiated. Obedience becomes selective. And slowly, jurisdiction changes. When that happens, access returns. Most people never notice the moment it occurs. They only notice the aftermath. Increased conflict, sudden heaviness, repeating cycles, emotional exhaustion with no clear source. They assume it is stress, or coincidence, or bad seasons. But darkness always enters legally. That is the part no one wants to accept. It does not break in. It is invited through misalignment. The seal is not fragile, but it is specific. It does not coexist with divided authority. A home cannot belong to two masters. It cannot be aligned and autonomous at the same time. That tension creates gaps, and gaps become doors. The sealed homes we feared were not perfect, but they were consistent. Their allegiance did not change with circumstances. Their authority was not conditional on outcomes. That consistency is what made the seal permanent. I tell them the truth. Objects can remind, but they cannot rule. Authority does not come from what you display. It comes from who you submit to when no one is watching. Darkness knows the difference. Busy spirituality, loud declarations, endless activity, anything except surrender. The most protected homes I have seen were the quietest ones. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of occupation. That distinction matters. If you are listening to this and wondering whether your home is sealed, understand this. Fear is not a sign of exposure. Doubt is not disqualification. Struggle is not evidence of failure. The seal is not emotional. It is legal, and legality is established by authority. I did not leave darkness because I became afraid. I left because I realized its limits. I realized that everything we relied on only worked where permission had already been given. But that protection was rare. It isn't. It is simply misunderstood. The seal exists because authority exists. And authority exists because order exists. Darkness does not create order. It operates within it. That is why we could never enter homes that had the seal. Not because the people were stronger, but because the house no longer belonged to us. And once ownership changes, access ends. That is the truth I was never supposed to say out loud.